Welcome to the 32nd Vigil for Julian Assange. I'm Joe Lauria, Editor-in-Chief of Consortium News. I'm joined by Elizabeth Voss, contributor to Consortium News. Hello, Elizabeth.
Hi, Joe. Good to be here. How are
you?
Clearly,
I'm fine. Clearly the major story today, as we had last Friday, a major story with the indictment under the Espionage Act. Today, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture has issued his report, or at least a statement about his report, and it's a stinging rebuke to the United States, Great Britain, Sweden, and Ecuador. He names these countries. He blames them for deliberately exposing Julian Assange to years of cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment, which he says can only be described as psychological torture. Now, Mr. Niles Meltzer visited Julian on May 9th at Belmarsh Prison. This is what he says. In 20 years of work with victims of war, violence, and political persecution, I have never seen a group of democratic states ganging up to deliberately isolate, demonize, and abuse a single individual for such a long time and with so little regard for human dignity and the rule of law. He says the collective persecution of Julian Assange must end here and now. The evidence is overwhelming and clear, he goes on. Mr. Assange has been deliberately exposed for a period of several years to progressively severe forms of cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment, the cumulative effects of which can only be described as psychological torture. In the course of the past 9 years, Mr. Assange has been exposed to persistent, progressively severe abuse ranging from systemic judicial persecution and arbitrary confinement in the Ecuadorian embassy to his oppressive isolation, harassment, and surveillance inside the embassy, and from deliberate collective ridicule, insults, and humiliation to open instigation of violence and even calls for his assassination. It was obvious that Mr. Assange's health has been seriously affected by the extremely hostile and arbitrary environment he has been exposed to for many years. Most importantly, in addition to physical ailments, Mr. Assange showed all symptoms typical for prolonged exposure to psychological torture, including extreme stress, chronic anxiety, and intense psychological trauma. This report was given to those 4 countries on Monday. The Sydney Morning Herald claims to have gotten a confidential copy of it. No one else has seen that. But I'm reading from the statement that was put out by the Office of the Commissioner for Human Rights at the UN, of which the rapporteur's work. My most urgent concern, now, by the way, Elizabeth will be speaking next about Assange's health, what's happened to him, that we all know now he's been put into the prison hospital.
Right.
My most urgent concern, Niles Meltzer says, is that the United States, Mr. Assange will be exposed to a real risk of serious violations of his human rights, including his freedom of expression, his right to a fair trial, and the prohibition of torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. He said he was particularly alarmed by the charges under the Espionage Act. This may well result in a life sentence without parole, or possibly even the death penalty, if further charges were to be added in the future. He goes on to say, since 2010, when WikiLeaks started publishing evidence of war crimes and torture committed by U.S. forces, we have seen a sustained and concerted effort by several states towards getting Mr. Assange extradited to the United States for prosecution, raising serious concerns over the criminalization of investigative journalism in violation of both the U.S. Constitution and international human rights law. Now, the Herald, as I said, also interviewed Mr. Meltzer. He's been interviewed by the New York Times as well, by the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. And the Herald reports him saying that Assange is really something I've never seen in 20 years. I've seen atrocities in war areas that were physically more horrible, but I've never seen a single person pursued so relentlessly and with so little foundation. When I saw him, I immediately compared him to some of the graver cases in interrogation prisons in terms of his psychological reaction patterns. That's what alarmed me so much. He said his treatment was very close to intentional, purposeful infliction of coercive measures to try to break him. This is particularly disturbing. Meltzer says that Julian Assange appeared extremely agitated and preoccupied. He asked a lot of questions. This is when Meltzer saw him on May 9 with two doctors. He said he asked a lot of questions, and he would jump around. He was so preoccupied with everything, he can't even compute my answers anymore. There were episodes of this. Then he was part of the conversation as normal. Then again, he would enter into this agitated state. I have seen with other victims of psychological torture that would happen. He also criticized Australia, saying, quote, Australia is a glaring absence in this case. They are just not around, as if Assange was not an Australian citizen. That is not the correct way of dealing with that. A spokesman at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in Canberra told the Sydney Morning Herald, quote, we reject any suggestion by the UN Special Rapporteur or on torture that the Australian government is complicit in psychological torture or has shown a lack of consular support for Mr. Assange. Stronger than that was a refutation by Britain's Foreign Secretary, Jeremy Hunt. He condemned Meltzer for this report. Hunt said it was wrong for the rapporteur to interfere with British justice by uttering inflammatory accusations. Here's the full tweet from Jeremy Hunt. This is wrong. Assange chose to hide in the embassy and was always free to leave and face justice. The UN Special Rapporteur should allow British courts to make their judgments without his interference or inflammatory accusations. That elicited this reply on Twitter from Mr. Meltzer. With all due respect, sir, Mr. Assange was about as free to leave as someone sitting on a rubber boat in a shark pool. As detailed in my formal letter to you, so far UK courts have not shown the impartiality and objectivity required by the rule of law. Elizabeth.
Absolutely incredible. I thought it was shocking to hear that kind of description of Assange in that state. It's not surprising, but it's horrifying, deeply, deeply horrifying. So,
indeed,
we have
and
that
the language could not be stronger from the rapporteur. He actually did the job he was supposed to do, in my view.
Yeah, and I think actually that's what surprises me more than anything in the report, unfortunately, is that he was willing to say this so bluntly. We have, additionally, this article regarding WikiLeaks' expression of concern over Assange's health, grave concern over Assange's health. It's from Consortium News, and we'll just be reading it now before we open this up to our guests. So WikiLeaks said on Wednesday that it was gravely concerned for the health of its publisher, Julian Assange, and questioned Britain's standing as a human rights abiding nation. WikiLeaks has condemned Britain for its treatment of Assange, expressing grave concerns for Assange, who has been transferred to the health ward of Belmarsh Prison in London. In a statement released on Twitter on Wednesday, the publication also condemned Ecuador for having created conditions incompatible with basic human rights for Assange, who had been granted asylum in its London embassy and remained there for almost 7 years. He was cut off for the last year from the internet with only minimal visits permitted. Assange is serving a 50-week sentence in the maximum security prison for skipping bail in 2012, when he was wanted for questioning by Sweden on sexual assault allegations. That year, he entered the Ecuador's embassy and remained there until British police were invited to arrest Assange on April 11th this year. He had sought asylum, fearing onward extradition from Sweden to the United States to face charges under the Espionage Act. As he predicted, the US filed an extradition request with Britain the day he was arrested, and last Thursday he was charged under the Espionage Act for possessing and disseminating classified information. Britain had twice ignored rulings by the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention that the UK should let Assange free and pay him compensation. The UK's refusal to abide by UN rulings and its subsequent treatment of Mr. Assange since his arrest presents serious questions about the UK's standing as a human rights abiding nation, WikiLeaks said in its statement. Assange has been kept in isolation for 23 hours a day at Belmarsh and has been allowed only a handful of visits from his lawyers. The UN Special Rapporteur for Torture visited him with a doctor who examined Assange earlier this month. The rapporteur's report has not yet been released. But during the 7 weeks in Belmarsh prison, his health has continued to deteriorate and he has dramatically lost weight, WikiLeaks said. News that Assange's health had declined to the point that he would be transferred to the prison hospital was first reported by the Swedish daily Uppsala Nya Tidning, in which quoted Assange's Swedish lawyer, Per Samuelsson, saying that his client was so ill that a normal conversation with him was not possible. Samuelsson had requested, therefore, that Swedish authorities postpone a June 3rd hearing on a renewed Swedish extradition request to the UK onto the sexual assault allegations, a request that was denied. We strongly condemn the refusal by the Swedish court to postpone a hearing on the 3rd of June on the basis of Mr. Assange's health condition, WikiLeaks said. Here is the full statement from WikiLeaks, which I'll read now. WikiLeaks stated, quote, WikiLeaks has grave concerns about the state of health of our publisher, Julian Assange, who has been moved to the health ward of Belmarsh prison. Mr. Assange's health had already significantly deteriorated after 7 years inside the Ecuadorian embassy under conditions that were incompatible with basic human rights. The United Nations twice found him to have been arbitrarily detained and called on the UK to honor his commitments under the international law and free him. The UK's refusal to abide by UN rulings and its subsequent treatment of Mr. Assange since his arrest presents serious questions about the UK's standing as a human rights abiding nation. In his last year in the embassy, as the US finalized its extradition plans, Julian Assange was, at the behest of US authorities, totally isolated and gagged, a situation designed to make his life as hard as possible. During the 7 weeks in Belmarsh, his health had continued to deteriorate and he has dramatically lost weight. The decision of prison authorities to move him to the health ward speaks for itself. We strongly condemn the refusal by the Swedish court to postpone a hearing on the 3rd of June on the basis of Mr. Assange's health condition. Defense lawyer for Assange, Per Samuelsson, said that Julian Assange's health state last Friday was such that it was not possible to conduct a normal conversation with him. Tomorrow, May 30th, there is a formal hearing in Westminster Court on the extradition request by the Trump administration. The initial U.S. warrant has been expanded to include a life sentence or potential death penalty under the Espionage Act, announced last week in the superseding indictment, which disclosed 17 additional charges, bringing the potential sentence to 175 years in prison. The indictments have been widely condemned by free press organizations as the most serious attack against publishing activities in journalism. In modern times, The Trump administration, in essence, criminalizes the very act of journalism, and the indictment utilizes the archaic Espionage Act of 1917 to indict a publisher for the first time in history in an unprecedented escalation of the Trump administration's war on the free press. Kristen Hafrenson, WikiLeaks editor-in-chief, said, quote, Julian's case is of major historic significance. It will be remembered as the worst attack on press freedom in our lifetime. The people need to voice their condemnation. It is their politicians, their courts, their police, and their prisons that are being used in order to leave this black stain, abused in order to leave this black stain on history. Please act now to avert this shame. And that is the end of the statement. Joe, what are your thoughts on that?
Yes, I just wanted to follow up what you read was written, of course, before the rapporteur's report was released today. So when it says that it hadn't been released yet, it's referring to, in fact, to that report that was given to the British and American governments on Monday and that has been made public, at least the contents, some of the contents, by the rapporteur himself in his statement. There's a link in Consortium News to that statement that you could read. Also, for some reason that he didn't explain, the rapporteur said that though Assange is 23 hours alone in a cell, he is not considered at solitary confinement. So I don't know if that's changed or if it wasn't the case when he was there, but that's just something I thought I'd add. We have one more news item before we begin discussing all of this in depth, and that is the New York Times reporting. I think this is an AP story, actually. In the New York Times, Associated Press, from today, Friday, lawyers for former Army intelligence analyst Chelsea Manning are renewing efforts to get her released from a Virginia jail. Manning's lawyers filed court papers Friday asking a federal judge to reconsider his decision to send Manning to the Alexandria jail for refusing to testify to a grand jury investigating WikiLeaks. Manning has been jailed for civil contempt since May 16. This follows a 2-month jail term this spring for refusing to testify to a previous grand jury. The court motion argues, this is interesting, that a new indictment of WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, of course that came out last Thursday, makes Manning's testimony irrelevant. The court papers also include a letter from Manning explaining why she views the grand jury as morally unacceptable. It adds, of course, that Manning spent 7 years in a military prison for delivering a trove of classified information to Assange. So it's just logical to ask, if this superseding indictment came out on Thursday, why are they holding her? What do they need from Chelsea Manning? Is there going to be a superseding indictment to supersede the superseding indictment? I mean, what else could they add? The only charges they seem to have left were to cook up, to use this archaic law of the Espionage Act, particularly Section E, which says anybody in the world who possesses American and classified intelligence that is not authorized to do so, and also who disseminates that information, is liable to be prosecuted under this act. And that would include any person in the whole world who has retweeted, who has posted on Facebook, or has sent an email with an attachment from a document WikiLeaks has released that the U.S. government still considers classified. So it's under that law that Assange was indicted, and that caused this outcry from members of the mainstream media in the U.S. and elsewhere, not caring at all about Julian Assange as a person. They still took all these pot shots at him, but they're looking out for their own interests, because they realize that if the indictment goes through, in other words, if he's prosecuted and he's actually tried in some fashion and is jailed, that they could be next, because they've done the same thing. Many of these newspapers, like the New York Times and the Guardian, Der Spiegel, etc., actually partnered with WikiLeaks on these stories and published the exact same classified information. So they, Elizabeth, this is my view, that the public opinion is turning even more in favor, or let's say against, the Trump administration, and now the British government as well, and the Swedes and Ecuador. When you combine that Espionage Act indictment and the reaction that engendered with this rapporteur's report, I'm finding it very hard to believe that he could be extradited from the UK, or that he wouldn't win an appeal at the European Court of Human Rights. First of all, his health. Usually, right, the health of a prisoner is paramount to understand, to whether or not he's able to be extradited or not. And would he be able to get a fair trial if in the condition that he's in? Number two, do they want to send a journalist to a country that's going to prosecute him for practicing investigative journalism, which is what he did. He did, because that's what the indictment, if you read it carefully, explains, that he encouraged his source to get him information, and he tried to hide his identity. That is what every journalist does. And now we have this torture report. If he's been treated like this so far in the embassy and now in the prison, will they want the European Court of Human Rights? Would they want to allow him to go to the United States, where, the U.S. has openly committed and practiced torture since 9/11? We have a president who has said during the campaign that he wants to do worse than waterboarding, that he likes torture. I mean, this is something hard to fathom, particularly since it's against U.S. law and international law to torture someone. So the rapporteur on torture did, in my view, his job, and he showed a lot of guts, especially at the end there, what I read when he stood up to Jeremy Hunt, Foreign Secretary of Great Britain, of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So he's telling them, stick it. This is my job. I don't care how powerful you're military, your ally, United States. I'm there to assess whether this man was tortured or not, and this is my assessment. He was psychologically tortured, and his physical health has declined rapidly. And he was. What I really find, Elizabeth, really incredibly stunning is the way he accuses these states of ganging up on an individual. I mean, that is very, very strong language that I've never seen a group of democratic states. I think that was a little twist there. Put the knife in and twist it. These are so-called democratic states ganging up on to deliberately isolate, demonize, and abuse a single individual for such a long time. And later he says, without foundation.
I think it was brilliantly written, and I agree. I think that was shocking in a positive sense, that he was willing to go that far. and described not just the medical sense in which Assange has suffered and is suffering under these conditions, but also discussed the death threats, the baseless smears, and the basic attacks on Assange over these years from the press, while he's been not only, confined arbitrarily, but also for that last year, gagged and unable to defend himself in any way. So I thought it was fantastic that that he was able to describe that, as well as the strictly medical suffering that Assange has gone through.